Protection. Shifters Forever Worlds. Written by Elle Thorne. Narrated by Megan Kelly. Chapter 1. Grant Waters picked up the pace. Not that he was anxious to see Chelsea. Okay, yes he was. He'd been seeing her every 3 weeks for 2 months. He'd been seeing her since she first moved to town. On a professional level, of course, only. Not that he wouldn't love to see her more often, and see more of her. Damn, the thought of that made his cock twitch. He'd better control that before he walked into the hair salon where she worked. The last thing he needed was to scare her off with a raging hard-on. A glance at his watch confirmed his appointment was in 5 minutes. He took a deep breath of the cool winter air, then let it out slowly, and tried to think of anything that would make his arousal lessen. Good luck with that. Might as well go in and see her and get his hair cut. He clicked the fob, locking the door on his pickup, ran his fingers through his hair that didn't really need a cut yet, and never really needed a cut when he scheduled his appointments, and yet he did. Every 3 weeks, like clockwork, he was back. Back for more Chelsea. Grant? He turned toward the voice. Mae, the salon owner, called his name. Seemed she was headed toward the salon, too. Not working today? He asked her. Needed to pick up a couple of supplies. She raised a bulky box an inch or two, then settled it against her torso again. Let me help you with that. He stepped her way and relieved her of the burden. She looked at his hair, cocked her head, and a tiny smile played on her lips. Is it already time for another cut? He nodded and waited for her teasing. She enjoyed picking on him for coming in so often. It was on the calendar. As if he wasn't the one that put it there. When are you going to ask her out? You'll save a lot of money on haircuts. You want me to save money on haircuts? Seems like that would cut into your income. And that would worry me? Another smile from Mae. He knew the income didn't matter to Mae. She was well off financially, set for life as she'd told him when he'd asked her if she'd be okay after she lost her husband. Owning the beauty salon allowed her to pursue her other interests, namely, helping others. He exhaled, watching his breath in the cold air. Maybe today will be the day. I'm not sure if she's as interested. He shifted the box to one hand and opened the door to the salon with the other. You have doubts? You? Not that impossible to believe, is it? He shook his head at the hopelessly romantic matchmaker that Mae was and stood aside so she could precede him into her shop. His kind mated for life, and life to his kind meant forever. It was no small thing to ask a human to commit to life with a shifter, forever. Mae was no stranger to that. She lost her shifter husband many, many years ago and had never taken another. Chapter 2. Chelsea looked at the clock for the 50th time since 10 a.m. Grant's appointment was at 11, in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. A warm flush ran through her body, a surge of excitement to see him again. She looked in the mirror, pulling her smock off. She didn't need it accentuating her extra curves. She certainly didn't need it adding any extra pounds. She turned, looked at her backside in the mirror. Geez, what she wouldn't give to have a smaller ass. She shot an envious glance toward the hairdresser in the next station over. Probably a size 2. Then Chelsea looked back at her own ample derriere. He'd never give her a second glance. Yet he was kind of flirty, so maybe? Or maybe he's just being nice to his hairdresser. She promptly put herself back in place. Don't go getting your hopes up. Your regular should be here in a few, right? Said Lana, the size 2 next to Chelsea. Chelsea's cheeks grew warm. She chanced a peek in the mirror. Yep. That embarrassing red color was creeping its way up her chest to her face. All 6'4", wide shoulders, and piercing blue eyes of him. I'm not sure. Sure you aren't. Okay, hopeless. Of course she looked forward to seeing him, had ever since the first haircut she'd given him 1 week after she took this job, which seemed like ages ago. The sound of the door opening and closing brought her back to the present. She busied herself with the scissors, dryers, and brushes at her station, pretending she wasn't expecting or anxious to see him. Chapter 3. Grant set the box down on the reception desk and closed the door behind him, trying not to be too loud and bring attention to himself.
"See you later, Miss Mae."
He gave his good friend a smile and headed toward Chelsea's station. Mae gave him a coquettish smile. She seemed to enjoy that he called her Miss Mae, though she didn't look a day over 30-something. He was hoping to escape from Lana's blatant flirting before he was situated in Chelsea's care.
Whoa, holy mother of fine asses.
The first thing he saw was Chelsea's ass as she bent over and arranged things at her station. He paused, taking his time to enjoy the sight. By the heavens above, that was one tantalizing view. A jerk in his pants concurred with that assessment. Chelsea whirled around. "Grant!" Her voice was breathless and low. He wished that it was because he'd entered. He wished that it was because of him. Probably only because she had been leaning over and had stood up too quickly. Her smile showed off perfect white teeth. He imagined those teeth grazing his skin, teasing him. Still smiling, she said, "Today's your day. Seems like just yesterday you were here." He hoped that didn't mean she was disappointed to see him. He enjoyed the time they spent together while she washed his hair, massaging his scalp, and talking about different stuff. Thankfully, the robe thing she would place over him hid the effect she had on him. More or less. Probably less. But between that robe and his pants, he always managed to hide the tent he pitched for her while her hands worked through his hair, and her soft voice with that sexy tone pulled on him. "Grant!" Lana's screech disrupted the salon's serenity. She lunged his way, locking him into a hug, her body pushing against him. He noticed Chelsea's crestfallen expression and quickly pulled himself from Lana's grasp.
"Hi, Lana. Sorry, I think I'm late for my appointment with Chelsea."
"When are you going to let me tend to your hair and your other needs?" Lana's hand drifted over his crotch as he drew away. He threw a glance at Chelsea, hoping she hadn't seen that, and even more, hoping that she knew he was disinterested in Lana. He had to make it clearer to Lana to back off, it seemed.
"I'm good. Thanks."
He kept his voice cool, but had to pry her other hand off his bicep. He walked up to Chelsea.
"No hug for me?"
"I wondered if you'd already gotten your daily allotment." A smart-ass smile crossed her face just before she turned around and reached for the robe. That's what he loved about her sense of humor, and her awesome personality. Well, there were a couple more things. Her nice full ass, her hips, a set of tits that would fill his hands and overflow, nipples that he couldn't help but notice.
"Not when it comes to yours."
He gave her a wink and took a seat since her turning for the robe negated a hug. She laid it over him, wrapping it around his neck. "I need to get one that's larger so I can actually close it around your neck."
"You've been saying that for a couple of months now. I'm beginning to think you're all talk."
She laughed and put her hands on his neck, her thumbs and fingertips rising up to his scalp, her nails raking his skin, her thumb pads massaging. "You know you don't really need a haircut just yet. I don't know why you get your hair cut so often." Her eyes twinkled, dark chocolate against her fair skin.
"Really? No clue?"
It was past time for him to quit beating around the bush, as Mae had pointed out. The blush that colored Chelsea's cheeks made her eyes sparkle and fueled his desire to see how far down her body that blush would extend. It also affirmed that she was at least a little interested. Maybe. He breathed in deep. His bare senses took in her scent, her arousal and desire. His eyes closed, partially in response to the fierce need to mate with her that effused his body. His bear sought to take control of the situation and claim her, make her his, mark her for life.
"So what do you say?"
He struggled to keep the desire from showing in his voice. "To what?" She ran her fingers through his hair again. "Let's go to the chairs, wash this hair, then we'll see if I can give you a trim." Fighting to keep his bear from staring at her luscious ass as it swayed, imagining what it would be like to smack her with his palm while driving deep into her. For fuck's sake, he had it bad. This time it was worse than any other. He bit back a roar of desire at the image of taking her from behind, those luscious, creamy globes pressing against his flesh as he pumped her and slapped that ass. "Grant?" She turned around to face him. He'd missed something she'd said. "Damn it."
"Yeah?"
"Never mind."
"No. What?"
He took hold of her hand, stopping her from turning around and leading him to the back. "Oh, I was just asking you to finish your thought from earlier." If she only knew how many thoughts he'd had and how lascivious. He knew what she meant.
"I was asking what you'd say to the idea of maybe dinner. We could head into the city, not this town."
He laughed because the town they were in could hardly be called one.
"And we could do something?"
She tilted her head. "Something?" Her voice had a little teasing in it. She indicated the chair. He sprawled into it, the contraption barely containing his large frame. Behind his head, she turned the water on and sprayed his hair with the warmth. She leaned over him, reaching for the shampoo. Her luscious breasts were a tongue's length away from his mouth. If she didn't have clothing on, if they were alone, he could claim the nipples that were poking out of her top, their hardness barely concealed by the fabric, their outline and shape tempting his senses, bringing the bear in him to a fury for a taste. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, things would have been different. That was before he'd found a mate he wanted, Chelsea. That was when he would have found a willing, wet, and warm place to drive his thickness into. Chapter 4. Chelsea leaned over and tried to get a squirt of the shampoo into her palm without rubbing her breasts on his face. There were times she hated having boobs so big. She wasn't sure if this was one of those times. She held her breath. This man's sex appeal was too much.
"Chels?"
She loved when he'd given her that nickname, remembering the day clearly. She'd never been called that before. She exhaled slowly and looked into his deep blue eyes, fighting the urge to lean down and kiss him, knowing that she'd never give in to that urge. "Yes, Grant?"
You missed... It kind of..."
He lifted his hand, almost touching her breast. Mortification settled in. The shampoo had squirted right onto her breast, exactly over her nipple, and she'd been so into him she hadn't even noticed. Chelsea ran her thumb over it, embarrassed that her nipple perked and pebbled under her touch and his penetrating gaze. She gave him a sheepish grin. "Thanks for noticing, for the daydream, for telling me." Amusement and something else flickered in his eyes.
"You didn't say yes."
He reminded her that she hadn't answered his question about going out. Was he taking pity on her because she didn't have a life? Because all she did was sit at home after work, night in, night out, and read those stories about hot Highlanders claiming they're willing women? About werewolves taking a bride and making her one of their own? She lathered him up, and a blush rose to her cheeks at the thought of the story she was currently reading. A book about a girl like her who fell in love with a sexy alien who was on Earth to abduct her. Except the alien fell in love with her, and instead of stealing her for his people's evil intentions, he ran away with her and started a new life. She sighed without realizing it at first and rinsed the shampoo suds out. Of course she wouldn't say no to Grant, even if his reasons for asking weren't necessarily the same as hers for accepting. She could use a friend in town other than her boss, Mae. Mae kept telling her if she had a better car, she could go into the city. It was only an hour away, and she could make friends her own age and date and stuff like that. Mae didn't know that Chelsea used her car as an excuse because Chelsea didn't really want any of those things. Chelsea avoided high-population areas, and she didn't want any other man than Grant, the only man she'd wanted since she'd first laid eyes on him. Talk about setting your sights too high. Oh well. I'll go with you. Chelsea reached for the conditioner, careful not to get any on herself, careful not to rub her breasts in his face. His expression lit up with a smile that showed off perfect white teeth and made her think about what he could do with those teeth and that mouth. Her face warmed once more. She really was in a sexual drought. If she hadn't been head over heels for him, she'd have found a way to alleviate the drought. She raised the stream of water, rinsing out the conditioner, patted his head with a towel. Because he kept his hair short, towel drying was an easy feat. She led the way to her chair. Having small talk was limited because of Lana's proximity. That, and Lana's constant leaning toward Chelsea's station, meant there was no privacy. Chelsea wrapped up his haircut, a 5-minute job that she stretched into 15, just so she could keep her hands on him, even if it was only his head. Let me blow it dry? It's chilly outside. You don't want to go out and catch a cold. Chapter 5. Grant laughed.
I didn't take you for the superstitious type. Colds are caused by viruses, not by temperature.
That's not a superstition. Chelsea smiled back.
So you believe in things you can't see?
Mae glanced up from the desk in the reception area. He knew she could hear him. She gave him a look, as if to question what his reason was for asking that, as if to question his wisdom. He shook his head, one shake, almost imperceptible, and turned back to his luscious, curvy, light-brown-haired woman next to him.
Well, Chels?
I believe in a lot of things. Her smile held a secret. He hoped he'd get a chance to learn it.
How about Friday at 7? I'll pick you up at your place?
He didn't need to ask her where her place was. She rented a room from Mae. The salon fell silent. Everyone turned toward the door. Grant looked to see what had garnered their attention. Jeff Landers. Grant bristled. The instinct to resort to violence rose in his bear. He picked up a scent of fear that carried over from Chelsea. Clearly, she didn't care for the land developer. He could understand dislike, but why was she transmitting fear? Why was she afraid of him? Jeff let the door close with a slam, ignored Mae's greeting, and strode straight for Chelsea's station.
I hope I'm not late.
His voice had an arrogant twist to it. He glanced at Grant, locked eyes with him.
Have you given my offer any consideration? You have far more land than you need. The community would benefit from an amusement park in Bear Canyon Valley. You're the only one keeping this community from its prosperous dream.
Grant fought back the derisive laughter that rose in his throat. The only one who thought this community needed an amusement park to kill its tranquility and run its residents off was Jeff Landers.
I think I'll keep my land.
Grant walked by the man, noting that he stood in such a way that Grant had to make a concerted attempt to walk around him, or he'd run into him. Grant opted for the latter and bumped shoulders with Jeff. Jeff was no slouch, probably reaching 6 foot, but he winced when Grant shoulder bumped him. He turned to Chelsea.
I'm hoping you have an opening. I didn't make an appointment.
Behind them, Mae cleared her throat.
You really should have made an appointment. Since when do I need one?
Jeff looked over Mae's head at Grant, his eyes glinting his defiance and insolence.
So, do I get my hair cut or not?
He glared at them, then softened his gaze as his eyes landed on Chelsea. Grant gave Mae a pointed look. She shook her head slightly. Too bad, because he would have liked to have permission to take Jeff's impertinence and petulance outside for a lesson.
I'll take care of this.
Mae took Grant's bicep and guided him toward the door. Behind them, Chelsea was saying, Sure, I can help you out, Jeff. Her voice was stilted and forced, much like her smile. Grant waved to her.
See you Friday.
Chapter 6. Chelsea cringed. Grant saying that out loud made Jeff's eyes narrow. She hadn't wanted to help the rich developer. She could tell he had a cruel streak, and he had his sights on her. Why that was, she had no idea. Maybe it was to make Lana jealous. They used to date. That was probably it. Either way, he tipped $100 every time he visited, and she wanted to get him in the chair before Mae's temper flared. Mae made it no secret that she didn't care for Jeff. You'd think he'd learn his lesson and go to the city for his haircuts. He worked in the city, so why he came here? Yeah, probably to make Lana jealous. Chelsea bet she'd been right to begin with. She wondered why Jeff's appointments always managed to coincide with Grant's. Even Jeff's walk-ins coincided with Grant's. Jeff's predatory glances and his way too familiar touches on her arms, neck, and shoulders made her cringe inwardly. She fought to keep Mae from seeing how revolting she found his advances. He reminded her of a man she'd like to leave in the past forever. A man with a truly horrible cruel streak. His expression stern, Jeff sat in the seat.
"What's this about Friday?"
"Nothing," Chelsea mumbled. Telling him anything about it would serve no purpose. She wasn't into playing head games and pitting men against each other. And she wasn't even remotely interested in Jeff. She made quick work of washing, rinsing, and cutting his hair. She didn't offer to dry it, but he asked for a dry. She looked at Mae. Mae nodded. So she complied and did it cheerfully, although half-heartedly. Admittedly, the cheerful part was faked. Today was Wednesday. Tomorrow was her early day. She could go into the city for a new outfit for her date with Grant on Friday. That would be nice. She wondered if she could find something slimming that would accentuate the right curves and hide the wrong ones. She glanced up at Lana as she took the smock off of Jeff. Lana's slim figure was a mirror that reflected Chelsea's indulgences and guilty pleasures, particularly dark chocolate. She glanced away from Lana and looked at Jeff. "Thank you, Jeff. See you next time."
"Say, Chelsea!"
His voice was loud, too loud. It made her uncomfortable.
"What would you say to going out with me?"
Chelsea glanced at Mae. Mae's eyes narrowed at his words. "I don't think that would be a good idea, Jeff." Chelsea rubbed her palms on her too tight jeans, aware she was transmitting her nervousness. "I thank you, though. I'm flattered." Not exactly, since she didn't trust him, and something about him made her very nervous. Plus, it was clear that he and Grant did not get along. Was Jeff doing this to get to Grant? Jeff's jaw clenched and his knuckles gripped the banister on the way toward the reception desk.
"I wish you'd reconsider,"
he said through clenched jaws. "Can I think about it?" She hoped that would appease him, get him to stop, maybe even go away.
"What's to think about? A down-and-out, broke hairdresser would turn down a successful man like me? Do you know who I am?"
Chelsea didn't want to look at Mae, fearful that Mae was upset by the drama. She'd been so kind to give Chelsea a job here. Chelsea didn't want to be responsible for a scene in her friend's place of business. "Please, Jeff, lower your voice. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. Of course. Saturday?"
"Hell no!"
His voice was a nasal, offending hiss.
"Hell no! I don't want his seconds. Tonight. I'll pick you up at closing time."
"It'll be late, and I won't have time to change. Maybe another—"
"I'll be here tonight. You look fine."
He spun on his heel, threw a bill on the counter, and with a hasty,
"Keep the change,"
he stormed out. Chelsea stared after him aghast. Now what? She had put herself in a bad position. She wanted nothing to do with him, and she didn't trust him. And he wanted to get revenge of some sort on Grant. And she liked Grant. Okay, she really liked Grant. Chelsea sighed. Feeling eyes on her, she turned, catching Mae's squinting, narrowed glance. Chelsea grimaced at the expression on Mae's face. "I'm sorry." She started to explain, to tell Mae she didn't want drama. She didn't want to bring problems to Mae and didn't want them in her own life. She'd had enough of drama and avoided it at all costs now. She avoided it as much as she avoided the attention of strangers and the law.
You shouldn't have done that.
Mae's voice was bitter. I didn't mean to upset him. I know. I should have accepted the first time he asked.
You should have done no such thing. That's not what I meant at all.
Mae put her arm around Chelsea.
You are not obligated to go out with anyone, whether they're clientele or not.
A sob rose in Chelsea's throat at the woman's kindness. She hadn't felt this kind of acceptance since... She couldn't remember the last time. Chapter 7. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. It was almost closing time and already dark outside. Mae cleared her throat. Chelsea looked up at her, wondering what she was going to say, hoping that Mae hadn't changed her mind and wasn't going to tell her she didn't need any drama with her clientele and that Chelsea would have to leave the salon forever.
I want you to feel free to cancel with Jeff and Grant.
Oh, no. Chelsea's reaction was swift, catching her off guard. I... Spit it out, she told herself. It's not easy to say it out loud. She wanted to go out with Grant. She wanted a lot more than that. She thought of his hard body, his wide chest and expansive shoulders. A warmth flooded her body, starting in her chest, rising to her cheeks. How she hated that blushing came so easily. A thought occurred to Chelsea. Maybe this was Mae's way of saying that she didn't want Chelsea to go out with either man. For all Chelsea knew, Mae liked Grant in that way, and she didn't want to interfere with that. Anyway, she looked at the other woman. Mae was a stunning, curvy woman with flashing, almost black eyes and a tan that seemed to last year-round. Chelsea didn't think her pale rose coloring could compete with Mae's vivid complexion and features. Maybe Grant was asking the wrong woman out, and Chelsea should back out gracefully and let his courtship with Mae take its course. But how would she handle that? How could she handle watching Grant and Mae date?
Chelsea?
Mae was patting her shoulder.
What were you saying? You were going to say something?
A wave of sadness and reluctance washed over Chelsea. She shook her head, resigned to what she had to do. No, nothing. I was just agreeing with you. I shouldn't date our clientele. It's bad business. I'm sorry. She looked down at the black-tiled floor, littered with cut hair. I should sweep. Chelsea didn't look back at the other woman. She slipped away to the back room, allegedly for the broom, but mostly to allow herself to regain her composure. She didn't want anyone else to see how upset she was. So much for the shopping trip for something nice to wear on a date with Grant. She sighed, the sound more like a ragged breath torn from her body. Maybe she'd make the drive into the city tomorrow anyway, treat herself to a meal and some dark chocolate, yum, and even get herself a new outfit. Forget all these pipe dreams about someone like Grant being interested in her. For now, she had to get out of 2 dates, somehow. She should ask Mae for their phone numbers. Then she would call Grant and Jeff and cancel. She made short work of cooling down while she swept the floor. She was so absent-minded that she not only swept her station and the immediate area around it, she swept the whole shop. She put the broom back and returned to her station.
Feel better?
Mae smiled her dazzling smile. Chelsea nodded. Do you think I could get Grant's and Jeff's phone numbers so I can call and cancel?
Are you sure that's what you want to do?
Mae gave her a look of concern. Chelsea was overwhelmed by the woman's kindness and patience. She nodded. Positive. But she didn't feel positive. She felt like she'd been on a boat that had sunk and had plunged her into the deepest, darkest depths of the ocean.
You know, if Jeff's bothering you, we can call the police.
Chelsea gasped. No! Mae's head snapped up at the loudness of Chelsea's tone.
Okay.
She nodded in a reconciliatory way, as if to calm Chelsea. Chelsea hadn't meant to be so loud. She'd been caught off guard. That was the last thing she needed, calling the police. How could she stay off the grid if they called the police in and they happened to check on her? There would be a paper or cyber trail if anyone looked into her background. Mae stepped behind the desk and touched the keyboard behind a monitor. She clicked, then clicked again.
Well, we don't have Grant's number on file. You'll have to tell him in person.
She took a piece of paper and a pen, wrote something.
Here's Jeff's.
Thank you. Chelsea gave her a huge hug. I'm glad I met you.
It's mutual.
You two are so cutesy sentimental.
Lana's whiny voice came from behind them. A sound of disgust, almost a small growl, came from Mae. Chelsea studied Mae. Did she not like Lana? Why had she hired her, and why did she keep her if she didn't? Chelsea slipped to the phone in the back to call Jeff in private. She didn't want Mae to hear that conversation. She tapped the numbers into the handheld and put it to her ear. It gave the disconnected sound. Great. Just great. She tried again. The same thing. Shoot! So now what? She walked to the front of the salon. Mae looked up from the closing paperwork.
Are you okay?
Yes, I'm fine. She gulped air in. It's all taken care of. She hoped Mae wouldn't ask for details. That would mean lying to her, and Chelsea already felt bad about her lie of omission. Saying that things were taken care of bothered her. She looked away and busied herself with arranging products on the shelves and dusting. She hoped that Jeff wouldn't stop by while Mae was still there. Oh, geez, what would she do if he did? Mae shut down the computer, put the ledger away, and slipped the cash into a bank bag.
All I have left to do is assemble a product order, so it's ready to call in tomorrow morning.
She rubbed her temples.
Long day.
Chelsea jumped on the opportunity. I'll do that. Let me. I'll need something to do tonight. She tried for a cheery smile and prayed that she could shuffle Mae out before Jeff appeared, if he appeared. She feared he would, so she had to get Mae out. She put her arm around the stunning brunette and guided her to the door.
If I didn't know better, I'd think you were trying to get rid of me.
Mae laughed. Chelsea let out forced laughter, hoping it didn't sound fake. She helped Mae with her coat and held the door open for her. Go put your feet up and relax. Mae gave her a curious look, as if she might be suspicious, but not very.
I may do that, and watch a movie I recorded last week.
Chelsea locked the door behind her boss and proceeded to sort out the shampoos, conditioners, and styling products, noting which ones needed to be purchased on an order form for Mae. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 8 o'clock. She'd been at it for an hour and no Jeff. She breathed a sigh of relief, put her coat and scarf on, shoved her cell phone in her coat pocket, and opened the door. Chapter 8. Chelsea shivered as she pulled the door shut. She tested it to be sure it was locked. It was one of those kinds of doors you didn't need a key to lock from the outside. You opened it, set the lever, then let it close, and ta-da, it was locked. She tested it again with a vigorous tug. Definitely locked. One more time to be sure she tugged, and at the same time cursed her compulsion to double-check things. How irritating, worse than being superstitious. She tugged the coat around her body, wishing she'd found one her size when she'd gone to the second-hand store, but thankfully she'd found this one, even if it was too snug to button all the way up. If only she could drop a couple pounds. Okay, maybe a few more than a couple. She turned around, gasped, fell back. Jeff! He'd been standing right behind her, too close, almost touching. And now he was right in front of her. It was far too intimate and way too uncomfortable. I tried to call you. She started, then paused, immediately wishing she hadn't said that because she didn't want to set him off.
Why?
He raised a brow. His face, though handsome, had a look to it that made her want to back away. No, run away. Brutality was his prevalent expression. She tried to back up, but found herself pressed against the door. She scrambled for an answer to his question. I don't feel so well. I was trying to reach you to cancel. He clenched his jaw, his eyes squinting in the light reflected off the snow. Around them, the rest of the parking lot was deserted, snow unmarked by tire tracks. Unmarked by tire tracks? Where was his car? If there were no tracks... She shivered. That meant he'd been there for a while.
I never got a call.
His voice was more chilled than the night air. She shrugged, mostly for show. It wasn't a working number. I'm sorry.
So you'd like to postpone? A rain check?
She hadn't actually said that. She'd said cancel, but she didn't want to get into it with him on this very cold, damp night. The weatherman had said there'd be more snow, so the last thing she needed was to be out here with Jeff and away from her place. Yes, if that's okay with you. She would say yes now and get out of it later.
Friday night,
he said with a smirk. She knew he was trying to bait her. He'd heard her accept Grant's offer. Now he was putting her in a bad place. Well, maybe.
What's the problem, Chels?
His voice had a sinister quality to it, and his eyes were menacing. And he used Grant's nickname for her. A shiver ran its course through her body, a shiver that had absolutely nothing to do with the cold. She glanced up and down the lonely street, all storefronts dark, no houses on this road, a road that was more for tourists than locals. Only the streetlights offered company, standing like blind sentinels, offering little light and even less comfort. She crossed her arms over her chest to stave off the shivers. I don't know. Can we talk tomorrow? It's cold.
Sure. Let me give you a ride home, or we could drive into the city and grab a latte.
Yeah, right. The last thing she wanted to do was be trapped in a car with him. I'm feeling poorly. Do you mind if... not? She sidestepped in an attempt to walk around him. Jeff put his hand on her arm, his grip like a vice.
I think you...
He paused, a smile she didn't care for crossing his face.
Fine. Have a good night. Mind if I wait until you pull out so that I can be sure you got on the road without a problem?
She frowned, hesitating. It was nice of him to offer to make sure she got on the road safely, but...
I won't follow you home, but you should know this. If I wanted to know where you live, I am a realtor after all.
She held back an eye roll. She didn't work on the books. She was just renting a room. No one should know where she lived unless she or Mae had told them. She was off the grid and happy about Mae's discretion. She'd asked Mae when she moved in to keep things private, not because of Jeff, but because it was working out for the best. Chelsea wasn't ready to turn one problem in for another. She pointedly looked at his hand on her arm. He removed it with a flourish, as if it was a grand gesture on his part. Without a backward glance, Chelsea chirped her car unlocked and jumped into the freezing vehicle, wincing when her backside touched the cold seat. She jammed her foot on the brake and her finger into the start button of her Altima. Nothing. Nothing at all. She did it again. Still nothing. Shit. She muttered under her breath. Shit and damn. She glanced out the windshield at the vehicle nearby, headlights on. Jeff, waiting. Chapter 9. Come on, damn it. As if talking to the car would make any difference. She slammed her foot onto the brake and at the same time pressed the start button. Again nothing. What the fuck? She could wait. She could wait it out. Go inside and wait there. Maybe call Mae, see if she could give her a ride. Or she could sleep in the shop, in the waiting area, where it was warm and there was a row of seats she could squeeze herself across. That's exactly what she would do. A sharp rap on the windshield made her jump. Felt like actually jumping out of her skin. That's what it felt like. She snapped her head to the left and fought the disappointment from showing. Through the glass, Jeff raised his voice.
You okay? You're not moving the car, and it's a bit cold.
Tell him the car wouldn't start, or tell him that she still had some work to do in the shop, or what other options did she have? None. I'm fine. Just what, Smarty? I was waiting.
Are you having car problems? This isn't the kind of weather to mess around in, Chelsea.
His tone was nasal. Why hadn't she ever noticed that before? His voice grated on her nerves. She'd rather listen to Grant's deep, soothing timbre. Just a little one, but it's fine, Jeff. I can go back into the salon. It's fine.
You have a key to Mae's?
Surprise registered in his voice. Hell, she'd forgotten. She'd locked the door. She wasn't getting back in. No.
You can't stay here. It's too cold. Let me run you home.
She hesitated and saw the reaction to her hesitation in his expression. Anger flared in his eyes.
Don't be silly. I'm one of the area's top realtors.
He tugged on the door handle. Maybe she was being silly. She should let him take her home. She could tell Mae in the morning and figure out a way to get her car fixed. Mae might be able to tell her about a trustworthy mechanic, and with a lot of luck, this wasn't going to be an expensive setback. She released the lock and shoved her keys in her pocket. I appreciate it, Jeff. He took her elbow and led her through the parking lot to his black sedan. Chelsea studied the vehicle, wondering how a car could manage to look sinister when cars had no personality. The European machine gleamed in the darkness of the night, its shiny exterior evidence of the care taken by its owner. Jeff opened her car door for her, helped her in. His steps seemed a little too happy as he walked to his side of the car. She'd rather he didn't seem so joyful over her misfortune. He got in, reached across for her seatbelt, and pulled it over her, fastening it before she could protest. A shudder of revulsion rolled through her when his hand accidentally brushed across her breast, even though she was bundled up. When he fastened the belt, the snapping sound made her jump. The finality of it reminded her of the clanging of the cell door. She took a deep breath to calm herself. He started the car. Envy ran through her at the ease with which his newer, more expensive car started. And anger ran parallel to her envy. Anger about the position she was in, no means, no reliable vehicle, running, hiding. Jeff glanced in the rearview mirror, a tiny smile playing on his thin lips.
How about a cup of hot chocolate? You're looking blue.
Only if you're not with me. Thank you, but I'm tired, Jeff. I don't feel up to much, just a hot bath and my bed. The sideways leer he gave her when she said the words bath and bed creeped her out.
I can get takeout. You can enjoy it on the ride to your place.
Where the hell would he get hot chocolate at this hour? It would be a 15-minute drive and not on her way to her room at Mae's. She was sure of that.
Come on,
he continued.
It's the least you can do after standing me up, not wanting to give me a rain check. Here I am, your knight in shining armor, and you're not being very gracious.
Maybe he had a point. Okay, takeout will be fine. At least that would appease him. He was giving her a ride after all, and he had waited to see if her car would start. Maybe he had a redeeming quality or two. She felt like she'd be a heel if she didn't show her appreciation, even if he wasn't someone she wanted to date. God, why does that sound like I'm trying to talk myself into it? He drove more quickly than she preferred on the dark, unlit highway, taking curves and hills at a speed that made her hold her breath. 15 minutes of small talk and they arrived. He pulled into the parking lot. Drive-through? She pushed her hair back nervously.
My window doesn't roll down. Coming?
She studied Jeff hard. She wasn't interested in being manipulated. I'll wait here if that's okay with you. She tugged on her coat collar. This jacket's not really made for this kind of weather.
That's true. You'll have to tell me sometime where you came from. Someplace warm, I'm guessing. You should probably buy a better coat.
True. She hadn't planned on staying in this state as long as she had, but when the opportunity for a job and a place to live with Mae had come up, she couldn't find a way to turn that down. If she had, she'd have already gone through all her money.
I'll be right back.
He slipped out of the car door, taking the keys with him and letting cold air in. The least he could have done was left the engine running, she thought. Didn't he trust her not to steal his car? Less than 10 minutes later, yes, she'd timed him on her cell phone, he was back and handing her a cup of hot chocolate. He put the key in the ignition.
Sorry, I thought I'd left the keys here and the car running. I hope I didn't make you too cold.
She wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. I'm fine. She let the warmth and steam that came through the tiny drink hole warm her face.
Try it.
He smiled an encouraging smile.
They make it with real chocolate. Best hot chocolate you've ever had, I'll bet.
Jeff watched her eagerly as if he wanted her approval. She put the cup to her lips and took a tiny cautious swallow so she wouldn't burn herself. It's good, she murmured. The liquid warmed her insides. He pulled out of the parking lot.
Okay, so on to your place now. Do you live near Mae's salon?
No, 15 minutes in the other direction.
Oh, you live near Grant's property. That's close to the land I'm trying to acquire.
His face conveyed his dislike for Grant. She purposefully didn't respond. She didn't need to be dragged into the middle of that drama.
My plans for the land will benefit the entire community. An entertainment complex will bring people in droves. We have the potential to be one of the largest tourist destinations in the state. Imagine the money that would bring in to the people who live here.
Namely you? She held her tongue, took a sip of the comforting beverage, and looked out the window at the blackness of the forest. After a few moments of silence, Jeff cleared his throat.
You're friends with Grant.
He paused, waiting for her to either acknowledge or disagree. She said nothing, raised the cup to her lips for another drink.
You could tell him what a good thing that would be.
She lowered the cup slowly, pondering what to say. A bump in the road jostled the cup from her grip slightly. She gasped, more out of surprise than pain, as the liquid exploded out the tiny drinking hole and splashed on her cheek. She tried to wipe her face, but her hand wouldn't rise. Slowing the car slightly, Jeff took the cup from her hand.
You okay?
She looked down at her hands in her lap. Yes, I'm... Why was she slurring her words? Why weren't her hands moving? She raised her eyes from her lap to his face. That wasn't an expression of concern. It was more like expectation. What was going on? What? She still couldn't put a sentence together. What had he given her? Why couldn't she control her hands and her mouth? She started to panic. Her eyes widened, and she was sure her face held an expression that reflected her fear and horror. What had he given her? What had he put in the hot chocolate? Stupid, stupid, stupid.
Relax.
He put a hand on her wrist, his grip a steel band.
No one's going to hurt you. Not in a bad way.
His smile was nothing short of lecherous, his leer lustful. His thumb traced circles on her wrist. Chelsea wanted to pull her hand away, but couldn't. She couldn't move her hand, couldn't scream at him the obscenities she wanted to. She glanced out the window. They were passing the salon, and they were heading out of town. Where was he taking her? She hadn't told him exactly where she lived. What was he planning to do with her? The vehicle sped up, and the dark countryside seemed like a blur. She wondered if that was because she was becoming dizzy. She moved her right hand a bit, just a few inches toward the door. Then it went numb, and she couldn't control it again. She waited a moment, avoided looking at her hand so Jeff's attention wouldn't be drawn there. She flexed her thumb. It moved. She could feel it. Not much movement, but still. It was slow, torturous, painstaking, but she could inch it along.
I know you feel the same way. I can see it in your eyes. You're just shy.
His hand traveled up her arm to her shoulder. He pushed her hair away, almost lovingly. His hand drifted down over her breast, which thankfully was still covered by her coat, but that did little to alleviate the emotions raging in her at his actions. Chelsea tried to control the tears that were building in her eyes. He reached down, released her seatbelt, gave her a smile, and then put his hand back on her chest. He unbuttoned a button on her coat, glancing out the windshield, then back at her. He slipped a hand inside her coat, raised her top, pushing her bra aside. Her body didn't want to move. She tried to shake, to squirm, but her upper body was frozen. His fingers immediately found her nipple.
God, I can't wait to taste you. Look how hard your nipple gets when I touch it.
He pinched, his fingers merciless. Tears of pain rose to her eyes. Chelsea shook her head.
No.
She moved her hand one last time, gripping the door handle, praying it was one that would be unlocked when it was pulled on. She tried to tighten her grip. She jerked on the handle as the car took a curve. Her body kept traveling in one direction, while the car took the curve with mechanical precision in the other. Chelsea flew out of the car and hit the ground. Luckily, a patch of soft earth, a little snow, and some grass slowed her progress toward a tree trunk. Her forehead bounced off the trunk's bark, her body crumpling on impact. Chapter 10. Grant rolled over. Something had awakened him, and he was in a nasty mood at what being awakened had interrupted. He'd been having a hell of a dream. Chelsea was naked in his dream, spread eagle on his bed, while there it went again. He pushed himself to a sitting position. His cell, it was vibrating on the dresser. Naked, with a raging hard-on from hell, he padded to the phone.
Mae?
She'd better have a good reason for interrupting his dream. Sleep. Mae never called, hardly ever anyway, so when she did, it probably wasn't good news.
What's up?
Chelsea's missing. She had a measure of panic in her voice. His blood did the whole turning into ice thing. Not Chelsea. Not when they hadn't even had a chance yet.
Slow down. Catch me up.
Slow down. He told his own heartbeat. She had to be okay. He hadn't felt this way about a woman. Ever. No, he wouldn't think like that. He couldn't lose this precious long-haired curvy package with that pretty smile. Mae gave him the information, cluing him in on Jeff's attempts to bully Chelsea into going out with him, and Chelsea's decision to stay late at the salon, alone. He bit back a reprimand at Mae for leaving her alone. Just because he was convinced that Jeff had a shady side didn't mean that Mae had the instincts to do the same. She was human, after all, even if she'd been mated to a shifter. She had acquired some skills. The couple bond did that. But it didn't give her everything a born shifter had. Mae was still talking while he sifted through the information.
And she never made it home. I called her cell. No answer. I was going to call the sheriff, but I thought... You were right. There's no reason to bother the sheriff.
He shoved his jeans on, wincing as they caged his semi-hard cock in their confines. His protective instinct was strong. As an alpha shifter, he felt the urge to protect more fiercely. He would drive into town, check on her.
You called the salon, right?
No answer. I'm coming too. Lots of snow expected. She was still hyperventilating.
Mae, don't. I don't need to worry about both of you. Wait at home and stay near the phone in case I need you.
I'm going to feel useless. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have let her stay late without being with her.
A half-sob escaped her before she could stop it. He heard her clamp down on the sorrowful sound before it could finish.
You care about Chelsea,
he noted.
I do. There's something about her.
He couldn't argue with that. There was something about Chelsea that pulled at him and the bear inside him.
Mae, I'm going to hang up so I can get dressed and get out of here. Don't fret.
Easy for him to say, but not so easy for him to do. Worry ate at his gut like acid. He made the drive in record time, for him. The snow that had been threatening hadn't really begun yet, though the temperature was already too low for comfort. Human comfort. He enjoyed it, though he'd rather sleep the whole winter through. He saw Chelsea's car, lonely in the dimly lit parking lot. One little streetlight at the other end. He would have to talk to Mae about this, and the town. This was ridiculous. There should be better lighting. Pulling up near Chelsea's car, he noted in the light snow blanket that there were tracks, hers and a man's. He breathed deep, sniffing, absorbing, letting his bear analyze the scents.
Jeff.
Those footprints belonged to Jeff. Grant followed them, his and her footprints. That was definitely Chelsea's scent. The prints led to a set of tire tracks. It was clear she had gotten into her car and that Jeff followed her there. A sneer crossed Grant's rugged face. Jeff had probably put on a great front as a gentleman, but now there was no sign of Grant's woman. Grant grimaced at himself. He was already calling her his woman. She hadn't even really agreed to anything but a date, probably a casual date, though Grant didn't really think it was just that, because the looks she gave him, they said there was fire behind that smoke. A furnace, in fact. Anger fueled Grant forward as he followed the tire tracks. They led to the road and then vanished among countless other tracks. The only clue he had was that they veered to the right. He got in his truck and headed in that direction. When he was significantly out of town, he pulled into an alcove made by the forest and a long-abandoned road and parked the truck. He shoved his cell phone and keys into the glove box. Getting out, he set the lock with the number pad under the door handle and shifted. His clothes shifted with him, like always. He roamed the forest for an hour at a quick lope, pausing every few moments, hoping to catch her scent. Finally, he did. He increased his pace, ignoring the pain in his side from maintaining the speed for so long, going way too fast for even his powerful body to endure. The last time he paused to catch her scent, he knew she wasn't far. A grunt that was more like a moan of pain escaped his throat, because the other thing he smelled was blood. This was the moment it hit him. His feelings for this woman were much more powerful than he'd thought, and they were completely bound to his bear's consuming love for her. In the dimness, his bear eyes caught sight of her much sooner than his human eyes would have. He roared at the sight of her prone body, crumpled up against a tree, curled around it as if it were a lover who would offer solace. He increased his pace, shifting in the last few strides, becoming a man again. He paused next to her, panting, his chest heaving from 90 minutes of running and scouting for her. He touched her neck where her pulse would be. There it was, faint but present. In his chest, his bear could feel her heartbeat. She was shivering, shaking violently from the cold, but the shaking didn't wake her up. Grant took his jacket off, leaned close to her, bundled her, and picked her up. He nuzzled her neck, relishing in her life. Leaning against the tree, he braced himself and pushed her hair out of her face so he could examine the source of the blood. A knot, seeping blood slowly at the very corner of her forehead. A gash embellished the knot, the blood beginning to clot in its outer edges. He shifted to his bear form, knowing he had to get her to safety. Right now, the nearest and safest place was a cave a few 100 yards away. He could make it there, build a fire, and keep her warm against his bear form. His bear released another roar of anguish, this one softer as not to disturb her. A set of headlights shone brightly on him. His head snapped up. The headlights slowed. He recognized Jeff's car. Returning to the scene. He snorted. If Jeff got out to help her... The car was still, then peeled out, swerving and fishtailing in the snow and light ice.
Coward.
Jeff had to have seen her with a bear and was doing nothing at all to help her. Grant shifted to human, picked up Chelsea, and made his way through the thick undergrowth, the trees, and the bushes. Shortly, he was in front of the cave he'd used since he was a young boy, before this was even his own land, when it had belonged to his grandfather and the Native American woman he'd taken as his mate. A smile of reminiscence at the fond memories of his grandfather and grandmother crossed his face. This was Grant's private getaway. He'd never told anyone about it, not even his trusted foreman, Joe. When Grant wanted complete privacy, this was where he'd find it. Entering the deep cave, he found the setup he always left in the alcove near the entrance. Fixings for a fire, a sleeping bag that was protected from the elements and wild creatures in an oversized plastic trash bag, and the hay he'd lain on. Gently he placed Chelsea on the hay, fighting off the memories he had from long ago, the first time his grandfather had brought him here. Grant started a fire, unwrapped the sleeping bag, and swathed it around Chelsea. He shifted to his bare form and lay next to her to keep her warm. He'd have to get her to his truck, but right now, warmth was more important. The jagged gash had stopped bleeding, but her shaking had not abated. He inhaled her scent, relishing it, angered by what he was certain was Jeff's role in this. He'd seek retribution, but not yet. First, he had to make sure she was well. He paused, sniffed, inhaled again. That smell. A chemical smell. On her breath, coming from her pores, mixed with the scent of nervous sweat. He drew closer. Chocolate mixed with the smell. Her pulse getting stronger was a good sign that her head injury wasn't as bad as he'd originally feared. But still, that bastard Jeff left her to die. He bit back a roar of fury that threatened to overtake him. He shook from anger, his bare claws flexing. In his chest, a burning anger wanted to rear its mighty head and hunt for Jeff, to rip him apart bare-handed. He was torn between taking care of Chelsea and going after Jeff. She moaned and moved slightly. Her color was returning. Her lips were no longer blue. Her eyes fluttered, and she gasped for a breath. Grant shifted to his human form as quickly as he could, praying she hadn't noticed, been alert enough, awake enough. Grant? Her eyes focused on his face, recognition obvious. Relief even more obvious. She sputtered as if she was trying to say his name, but couldn't. He couldn't help the kiss he planted on her temple, near the bump and dried blood, but not near enough to create more pain for her. Shh, he shushed her.
You don't need to talk.
He tightened his embrace around her.
As soon as your body gets warm, I'll get you to a doctor.
No. The word was ripped from her lungs. She began to flail, flopping, trying to free herself from his embrace.
No?
He studied her face.
Calm down. Easy now. No what? No doctor?
She shook her head.
And if you have a concussion?
He didn't think she did, but he wanted a doctor's opinion. She shook her head again, vehemently.
Okay, look, I don't want you to get worse, but fine, okay? Call me a damn fool for agreeing. No doctor.
He hoped he could keep the promise. He tried to calculate how far he might be from his truck and decided one of the cabins on his property would be closer than the truck. They were old, from the time his grandfather had run the property. Most of them had electricity and other modern conveniences, but he wasn't sure if the nearest one did. It didn't matter. He could get it warmed up in no time. They were always stocked with firewood and other supplies, just in case, a habit he'd learned from his grandfather. He touched her cheek, his fingers dark against her fair skin. He planted another kiss on her temple, letting his lips linger, closing his eyes, absorbing the feel of her skin, the scent of her body. She snuggled closer, a tiny whimper of a sound escaping from her mouth. A new scent infiltrated his nostrils, one that stirred a desire in him. She was aroused. The scent of it was strong, permeating his pores, his nerves. Every cell of him was tuned in to every part of her. Chapter 11. Grant fought the desire to mate with her. His bear wanted to commit the couple bound, to claim her for life, forever.
Too early,
he cautioned himself. They didn't have an understanding. She had not agreed to become his mate, but that didn't stop the bear and the man in him from wanting to take her. To sink his cock deep within her channel, to be housed in her slickness and tightness, to love her curves, to claim every inch of her. To leave his scent on her, permanently marking her as his. A low, deep growl built in his chest, raging to come out in a roar. He moved his hand beneath the fabric of her coat, pushing aside her top and moving her bra down. One full breast popped out, free of the confines of its lace pattern. He thumbed her nipple, making circles, pressing on it, flicking it. In his warm embrace, Chelsea squirmed, a moan announcing her approval. Her slow, rhythmic wiggling and squirming massaged the hardness of his cock through the fabric of his jeans, making him throb with a need that was primeval. He studied her eyes to make sure she was okay, to make sure she wasn't under any effects from her earlier tribulations, and her eyes were clear, with no sign of anything that should concern him. His bear growled with impatience and desire. Grant dropped his hand over her belly, down to her crotch. He cupped her mound, applying pressure on her clit as she raised her hips and ground into his hand. With a swift motion, he unbuttoned and unzipped her pants and slid them down. Chelsea raised her ass to help with the pants. Her explicit response made his cock harder in his pants, throbbing with a need to enter her body. His self-restraint was being tested greatly. With her pants down and then off and her lower body unclad, he spread her legs, pushing them apart, releasing her scent. In the flickering lamplight, he saw her glistening moisture just below her neatly trimmed pussy. He licked his lips in anticipation, his taste buds ready to match her flavor to her scent. Watching her face, he lowered his head until his lips were just above the moisture. The heat of her rose, greeting his face. Grant paused, inhaled a deep breath, taking the essence of her scent deep within him, allowing it to permeate his spirit. Chelsea bit down on her lower lip. He could hear her heart beating a pulse that matched his own. She held her breath. Now her pulse pounded in his ears. Grant lowered his head a fraction of an inch and blew a gust of warm air on her lips, teasing them. Her legs quivered, her folds moving with her shiver. He put the tip of his tongue at the top of her slit. Then, burrowing in, he sought out her button, ready to give his full attention to her clit. Spreading her legs open further with his fingertips, he licked her clit, then sucked it in, alternately flicking and sucking while the nub swelled beneath his attention. Another quiver ran through her lower body. He cupped her entrance with his mouth, sucking one lip in, then another, releasing them with a loud pop. She gasped. Her hands tangled in his hair as she shoved her hips upward in a violent thrust. Restraint be damned. Slipping his hands beneath her rounded ass, he pushed her upward, shoving his tongue deep within her, plunging it in and out. Chelsea arched her back, screamed his name, and tightened her thighs around his head. His tongue spearing her channel while she came into his mouth on his face. Chelsea's muscles spasmed, her legs quivered. Grant raised his head, his face and mouth wet and shiny with her moisture, the product of their shared passion. His gaze was penetrating, looking straight into her core. She turned her head, unable to hold up under the intensity of the smoldering behind his eyes. She felt him moving over her, his body covering hers. He pressed his lips to hers in a light kiss. Parting her lips, she tasted herself on his tongue, tasted the pleasure he'd given her. Grant rose up a fraction.
I knew you'd be delicious.
He kissed the tip of her nose.
You're everything I thought you'd be.
She nuzzled against him, tucking her head against his neck. Safe. This was a new emotion for her, a very unfamiliar one, but at the same time it felt like she had finally come home. Only one thought plagued her mind. Mae. What would she do about Mae and Grant? Was there a Mae and Grant? Chapter 12. Grant let Chelsea rest for a while, allowing her to warm up before he packed her up, wrapped in the sleeping bag, and hiked to the cabin. He made his way easily through the darkness. Even in his human form, his bear's vision helped him to take the safest path to warmth and safety. He slipped the chain off the padlock and kneed the cabin door open. The air inside was only a hair warmer than the air outside, but at least there was no wind to drop the temperature even lower. He eyed the firewood stock. More than enough. This cabin hadn't been set up for electricity yet. He put that on a mental list to have his foreman handle. On all the cabins, just in case, because now he knew he could never anticipate which one he'd need. He wrapped Chelsea in the sleeping bag he'd brought with him from the cave. She'd rested in the cave after... A smile crossed his face as he set her on the couch. He used his bear senses and night vision to find the hurricane lamp and matches. As soon as there was enough light to keep Chelsea from being afraid when she awakened, he started the fire in the fireplace. The one-room cabin took very little time to heat up, and within a few minutes it was toasty. He grabbed a bottled water, took a washcloth, and dampened it. Drawing it over Chelsea's face, he was careful not to put too much pressure on her wound. Though she was asleep, she grimaced, her eyes opened slowly. "Grant?" She cleared her throat. "What are you doing?" It occurred to him she might be weirded out by what he was doing.
Don't worry, just checking on you.
She rubbed her forehead, wincing when she touched the bump. He ran the washcloth over her face again. Then,
You need medical help, just to be sure.
She shook her head vigorously, then winced, raising her hand to her head.
Want to tell me why I can't take you to the hospital?
No.
I saved your life, and you don't trust me?
I trust you to save my life, she began. Chapter 13. But I don't trust you to not break my heart or not bring in the police, even if it's by accident. But Chelsea couldn't say that. Chelsea felt bad about lying to Grant when she'd said she didn't remember. She remembered being in Jeff's car, but if she told Grant, then he might want to call the cops. She couldn't have that. She looked around. They were in a cabin of some sort, a one-room rustic cabin with a fireplace and hurricane lamps. She studied the contents of the room. Old-looking furniture, walls that indicated the cabin was constructed of logs. Where are we?
On my land, one of the cabins. I found you crumpled against a tree.
He crossed his arms over his massive chest, drawing attention to his muscles.
Chelsea?
His tone was stern.
A hospital?
No hospital.
This is ridiculous.
His rugged, handsome face was set, his jaw clenched.
What if I have my own doctor see you? You don't even have to give him your name.
His eyes closed in a slight squint, as if he was appraising her for an answer. She licked her lips, thought of what he'd done, thought of what they'd done in the cave, because she had to take an equal part in the blame. She reached for the water on the coffee table. He picked it up and brought it to her lips, studying her while she drank. Her stomach fluttered at the intensity of his gaze. Perhaps it was anger at her reluctance to go to the hospital. No, it was something else. If she hadn't known better, she'd have thought it was lust. The flutter in her stomach traveled lower between her legs, then rose as if led by an electric current, stopping at her nipples, making them harden into tight pebbles in her bra. Yes, I'll see your doctor. She prayed that wouldn't lead to disaster, but she had to trust someone sometime.
I don't want to take you out in the cold again, and my truck is relatively far. Without knowing what happened to you, I hate leaving you alone.
He raked his fingers through his thick hair, stood, began to pace back and forth in front of the rough-hewn scarred coffee table that was as long as the couch she lay on. What if he left her and Jeff found her? Please don't leave me alone. He stopped pacing, sat on the corner of the sturdy coffee table, took her chin in his long fingers.
What are you so afraid of? Do you remember something? How did you end up in the middle of nowhere?
Chelsea shook her head. He pounded his fist into his palm. She jumped back, caught off guard by the sound.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you.
I can't be alone.
I need to get you help.
Can we go in the morning? I promise, I don't think it's that big of a bump. I think the cold bothered me more than my head did.
It is morning.
But it's dark outside.
Yeah, for now.
He scratched his head.
I don't know. I'm not sure that this is a good idea.
Please, a few hours until daylight is here won't hurt.
Maybe you're right.
His tone was reluctant. He touched her cheek.
You're flushed.
It's toasty in here. She gave him a smile of appreciation. Much better than it was out there. He reached for her coat. Images of Jeff doing that came to her mind. She flinched.
I won't hurt you. Since when?
He cocked his head, studying her.
You've never acted that way with me.
She shook her head. She knew she'd have to tell him about Jeff sometime. She shrugged out of her coat. He took it from her, folded it in half, and turned around to lay it on the other side of the coffee table. A clatter sounded, something hitting the wooden floor. He reached down, showed her what had made the noise. My cell phone! She'd forgotten she put it in her pocket when she left the shop. It was a burner phone, and she never used it, but one small payment a month guaranteed her she'd have access to help if she needed it. Didn't do me any good tonight. Grant flipped it open, punched a couple of numbers in. She put her hand over the phone. What are you doing? He closed it, but kept it palmed.
Calling my foreman. He'll come get us and take us to my house. Then I'll call the doctor over.
No cops, Grant.
No cops.
He shook his head in agreement.
But you have to tell me what the deal is with you and cops.
One day. Chapter 14. Grant had let it go with her one-day statement. He had his own secrets. He couldn't expect her to reveal hers if he wasn't willing to do the same, and he couldn't do that yet. Because when he made his move to make her his, he had to be certain. The existence of his bear and how it could affect their relationship wasn't to be taken lightly. He'd agreed not to leave her to go get help and not to take her to find help right away because his bear told him she wasn't too badly hurt. Too badly. Grant was certain that he and his bear might disagree heartily on what each of them considered too bad. And though the bear in him had never led him wrong, Grant scratched his head, perplexed. This was worse than arguing with himself. He wasn't going to take any chances, not with a cell phone that would guarantee him a way to get her to safety. He tapped 10 digits into the buttons. Moments later, Joe picked up the line.
I'm in the cabin in the furthest northwest corner. Get the four-wheeler and come out. I have an injured person with me.
He barked it out without niceties or formalities. He and Joe had worked together for a long time. Joe was capable and no nonsense. A former manager at the rodeo, he got the job done. Grant turned to Chelsea.
He'll be here shortly.
He took her hand in his.
Trust me, okay?
She nodded.
One more call. No, 2.
He ticked them off on his fingers.
First, I'm calling my doctor to meet me at my place. He's trustworthy, believe me. Then I'm calling Mae because she's worried. I wouldn't have been out there looking for you if she hadn't called me to say you hadn't come home yet.
Mae called you? Chelsea's head tilted to the side.
Yeah? Why?
No reason, she shrugged. His instincts told him different, but he wasn't going to press the issue. He rose, walked away from the couch and made his calls, then turned back to Chelsea.
Doc Evans will meet us at the house. Mae said she's coming too.
He looked at the stunning woman with the creamy complexion and tried not to think of ravaging her. How he wished they'd been trapped here under different circumstances. Grant, her eyes looked sleepy.
Yeah?
He stoked the fireplace. He'd send Joe back to put out the fire later. Right now, that was nowhere near as important as Chelsea. Tell me about the bear. His head snapped in her direction. Did she know? How could she?
What do you mean?
The bear that was carrying me. I know that wasn't a hallucination. And then she rubbed her eyes. I sound crazy, don't I?
Nah, you don't. You sound like someone who hit her head.
And had been drugged, probably by that asshole Jeff. As soon as Chelsea was better, he'd settle that score. Then he could tell her. He needed to tell her the truth about him, about his feelings for her, about what being with him meant. Chapter 15. Chelsea snuggled against Grant in the four-wheeler, while Joe, a Stetson and boot-wearing cowboy, was up front driving. When they pulled into an asphalt-covered driveway that seemed at least a mile long, she began to wonder about Grant Waters. When the four-wheeler pulled alongside a house that on size alone could have been called a mansion, her suspicions were confirmed. Grant was not a poor man, not by a long shot. She gave him a sideways glance. What was he doing asking out a vagabond, wandering, nomadic girl like her? The oversized house was built of stones like a fortress, impenetrable. It reminded her of the pictures she'd seen of the fortresses and castles in Europe. This place is huge. It's so...
It's my grandfather's. It was. He built it in a time where there were threats. Not that there aren't any now.
I can't imagine the heating bill. She laughed. The amount Grant spent heating this place would sustain her for a year, she'd wager. Joe parked. She stood to get out, only to find herself swept into Grant's arms. You think this is necessary?
Humor me. I'll feel better knowing you don't have a concussion.
He took the steps two at a time without jostling her. Joe beat them to the door and opened it, and a warmth embraced her as Grant stepped into a grand hallway. A sweeping staircase was in front of them. To the left and the right were sets of double doors. As rustic and hardy as the outside may have seemed, the inside geared toward comfort and attractiveness. Definitely had a woman's touch. She bit back a taste of jealousy as she imagined that someone had decorated it for Grant. Grant opened one of the double doors to the right, then turned to Joe.
I can take it from here. Doc Evans will be over in a few. Thanks, Joe. You're a lifesaver.
His voice was somber. The double doors opened onto a library with a roaring fireplace that took up almost half a wall. Ceiling-to-floor shelving housed books that looked old. Across from the massive fireplace, a dark wood desk dominated the room. Two dark leather sofas flanked the huge desk. Grant set her on one side of the sofas and reached for a plaid blanket. The softness caressed her cheek as he tucked it around her. This is definitely a man's room, isn't it? There was so much she wanted to know about Grant. She hoped he'd take the question as an invitation to tell her about himself.
It was my grandfather's room. My grandmother decorated almost every other room, but this was his domain. She wasn't allowed here, not to decorate anyway.
Grant's eyes twinkled at the memory of his grandparents. Something worried her, stuck in the back of her mind. What makes you so sure your doctor won't feel the need to report my injuries?
For starters, he knows my secrets, my deepest, darkest, most damning ones.
She wished she knew his secrets, wished she knew more about him.
He's never betrayed me. He knew my grandfather.
He dissected her with a piercing gaze.
Want to tell me what you're hiding? Or maybe whom you're hiding from?
Grant watched Chelsea bite her lip, worrying it with perfect white teeth, giving him visions of her nipping him, those teeth scraping along the flesh of his chest while she lowered her head.
Damn, damn, damn.
He needed to derail the lust train right now. How about we both share? She offered. He fought back the smile that threatened to erupt at her bargaining methods. Didn't she know he was the last one who would ever hurt her with knowledge?
Leverage? Is that what you're looking for?
Her expression broadcast the internal battle she was struggling with. She was clearly torn between telling him and not telling him. I'm staying away from an ex-boyfriend. He nodded, a pensive look on his face.
You're going to extremes to do that.
She shrugged. He's not a nice guy. A shudder ran through her body. She pulled her legs up, tucking her knees under her chin to keep from showing her fear.
There's more,
Grant said.
Isn't there?
Chelsea sighed. Tears glittered in her eyes, catching him reflecting the fire's flames. He used to hit me. Grant closed his eyes to mask the anger that was forming deep within. He had no sympathy for men who hurt women.
So you ran away? Surely the law could have helped her?
Yes, but it was... The words came slowly. She closed her eyes as if reliving it. She was quiet for so long that he wondered if she'd fallen asleep or lost consciousness. He reached for her. When his fingers touched her cheek, she flinched.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were okay. You're fine, sweetheart. You're fine.
He wrapped an arm around her. She nuzzled her head into his neck. Tiny sounds of comfort that only his bear could have heard came from her.
I stabbed him.
A sob ripped from her throat.
I wouldn't. I don't do that kind of thing.
Another sob. He tightened his hold on her, made low, soothing humming sounds, and murmured words of comfort.
He was going to kill me, so I picked up a knife and held it out, and I stabbed him.
He died?
He tipped her head back to study her pain-filled dark eyes.
No.
Surely she realized that was self-defense.
You should have called the cops immediately.
He is a cop in a small town.
Dread smashed into anger deep within him. He knew how small-town law enforcement could be. He knew all about ranks closing.
So now you're living under the radar because of him?
I know he'll kill me if he finds me. He's got a scar on his cheek from that night. The knife slipped.
Her next sigh was more like a ragged breath struggling and rattling within her body. He felt that struggle as she lay against his chest. She raised her head, her eyes on his, then her gaze traveled lower to his lips, his chin, back to his lips.
If you keep that up, I'll do something I've wanted to do for a long time,
he whispered. Chelsea held her breath as Grant lowered his head. She closed her eyes so she could savor the sensation she knew was coming. His lips touched hers softly, pressing their fullness into her own full lips. A soft moan, unexpected, started in her chest, surrendering into his mouth. She felt like she'd come home, in a sacred, spiritual way she wouldn't be able to put words to if she were asked. His tongue parted her lips, demanding entrance, taking no prisoners, save one, her heart. Yielding to the commands his mouth made on hers, her hands rose, fingers digging into his hair, pulling him closer, punishing her lips with his. She was his prey, his salvation, retribution, and redemption. He slipped his hand under the blanket and cupped her breast through her bra. Her nipple was hard, a crest-tip button begging to be touched. He ran his thumb over it, and even with the bra's fabric between them, her response was uninhibited. His bear smelled the scent of her arousal, making his cock twitch and engorge, pressing against her hip. He raised his head. A deep breath escaped her.
What's wrong?
Her voice was a whisper. Is it me? You don't...
You? The only thing you are is perfection, but someone's approaching.
His bear was at attention, but not completely worried. He'd identified the approaching heartbeat. How do you know? I didn't hear anything. She studied him as if she doubted how perfect he thought she was.
Good hearing.
You still owe me, she said. A secret.
It's no secret that I want you.
Chapter 16. Grant waited patiently while Doc closed his bag. He knew from experience that Doc wasn't going to say anything until he was good and ready, but Grant's patience was running thin.
Well?
He tried to keep the annoyance from his voice. Really, he did.
How is she? Just a bump. No concussion. Needs a little rest, that's all.
Grant breathed a sigh of relief. Now if only he could figure out what was wrong with Chelsea. She'd changed in the last half hour. Suddenly, she wouldn't establish eye contact with him. Her answers were short, and when he sat next to her, she moved away. Mae gave him a look, asking, "What's up?" He shrugged. This was not the same Chelsea he'd been with earlier. As soon as he could get the others out of here, they'd have a talk. He'd tell her about the shifting, the lifestyle, and he'd ask her to be his. Grant found himself tapping his fingers on his thighs, wishing everyone would hit the road. Instead, Doc Evans and Mae were talking about the weather, and Doc's daughter Astra was asking Chelsea for hair advice. He found himself spending more time trying to control his bear's frustration and less time concentrating on his own. Finally, Doc Evans took a step toward the door, glancing at Astra.
Ready, or do you have more hair stuff to talk about?
"I'll be in to see you soon," Astra said to Chelsea. "I'm looking forward to it." Chelsea smiled at Astra. Then she caught Grant looking at her. The smile vanished, and she cast her glance away.
Thanks, Grant.
Mae gave him a hug and made for the door. Chelsea rose to her feet. "Mae, can I get a ride with you?"
Ride?
Mae looked at Grant. He looked at Chelsea, then back at Mae. Why the hell was Chelsea leaving? He paused, unsure what to say.
Shouldn't you stay and rest?
That was the best he could come up with. Chelsea looked down, wringing her hands. She continued. "I think I can rest at home. I've been such a bother already." "I think you need to file a report," Astra said. Chelsea gasped. Her head rose, her expression alarmed.
No.
Grant's voice was firm.
I made a promise.
He stepped closer to Chelsea.
I promised that I'd bring Doc Evans here because she didn't want the attention the authorities would give her.
"Please." Chelsea's voice was small. "I'd like to go home." Where was the woman he'd fallen in love with? The spirited, sassy, sexy woman. Now she was defeated, like she'd given up. Given up on what? On him? That she could keep her ex from finding her? Chelsea leaned back in Mae's car. Outside the car, a blanket of whiteness covered the trees and the roadside. She felt numb, didn't know what to say. She'd brought this on herself. She'd created a hassle with Jeff, one of Mae's customers. She'd infringed on Mae's relationship with Grant. Saying she was sorry seemed so lame now. The best she could do was pack her car and leave the valley first thing in the morning. Mae took the curves and turned slowly, maintaining a speed that was safe, never taking her eyes off the asphalt. As soon as they'd started on a straight stretch of road, Mae glanced at Chelsea.
Was it Jeff?
Chelsea didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to start problems for Mae. "I'm not sure. One minute I was locking up the store, the next minute I was lying in a ditch. All I remember is that Grant found me and—" Chelsea stopped. The whole bear thing was silly.
And what?
"It's silly. I think I was hallucinating. That a bear was there, carrying me." She laughed a hollow laugh. "Silly, like I said." Mae looked at her sideways, didn't say a word. "Anyway," Chelsea continued, "I wanted to say I'm sorry for troubling everyone. I hate that I was such a bother."
Bother?
Mae's voice was high-pitched. She laughed.
You're no bother. You're like family, like a sister to me.
She reached across the console, put a hand on Chelsea's, and squeezed.
I couldn't do anything less for you.
Tears sprang to Chelsea's eyes. She felt ashamed. Here she was, hours from kissing, and other things, very enjoyable things, with Grant, from betraying this woman with the man Mae loved. Now she felt like shit. Forget leaving in the morning. She'd leave today. She bit back the tears, regained her composure. They passed the road that turned into town where the salon and Chelsea's car were. Chelsea's head snapped toward the turn. Was Mae not going to take her to her car? "Where are we going?"
I'm taking you home to rest. You're taking the day off, if not the whole weekend.
"But my car."
I'll have someone help me get it later. Right now, we need to get you rested.
"Could you take me to my car?"
Should you be driving?
Mae put her hand back on Chelsea's. "Dr. Evans didn't say I couldn't." Mae braked slightly.
I'm not sure. Maybe I should call Doc Evans or Grant.
"No, there's no need to call anyone. Please." Reluctantly, Mae turned the car around.
Okay.
They should hate her for all the trouble that she'd caused them. Then Chelsea remembered she hadn't been able to get the car to start last night. If she told Mae now, then she'd know Chelsea had lied when she said she didn't remember anything after locking the door. 15 minutes later, they were in town. The salon was already open. Lana's car was there. Was Lana running it alone? Chelsea looked at Mae.
I unlocked and asked her to handle things while I came to Grant's place to check on you.
Mae smiled.
Now stop worrying about everything.
Would her car start now? No luck. It didn't. Mae shivered, hugged herself.
I'll call Jerry. Loose battery cable,
Jerry pronounced, shoving long hair off his forehead, leaving grease and dirt stains in its wake.
Try it now.
Chelsea's car started immediately.
Odd how it came loose like that,
Jerry said, waving the 220s that Chelsea tried to hand him away.
No charge. Friend of a friend and all that.
How about a trade? Chelsea suggested. A haircut or two in exchange?
That a hint?
Jerry laughed, his breath making white puffs in the cool air. No! Chelsea smiled, then instantly felt bad. She wouldn't be there to cut his hair. She was such a loser, offering him haircuts knowing full well she didn't plan to stick around. She got into the car to go to Mae's to pack. Mae stepped up to the car door before Chelsea could close it.
I'll follow you.
No, I've disrupted enough. It's fine. A short drive. I promise, I'll be fine. I'll rest. For 5 minutes before I write you a thank you note and leave. Mae frowned at her, but acquiesced. The drive was short and uneventful. Chelsea committed the house to memory. She stared at it, willing herself to remember every detail of the 2-story stone home. Mae had told her she'd been living there for years, that she'd shared it with her husband. She was so young to be a widow, and without children, too. Chelsea was sad for her until she thought about Grant and how Grant would give Mae all the things she needed and wanted. Then Chelsea was sad for herself because she would never have those things. Putting the car into reverse, she backed into the driveway to make it easier to load her trunk. She unlocked the front door and took the stairs to her room slowly, unwilling to rush into the sad task of leaving. She opened the door to her room.
Didn't think I'd let you go that easily, did you?
Chapter 17.
What's with Chelsea?
Doc Evans crossed his legs, getting comfortable in the large library.
You never bring outsiders to your home. She's the one, Doc.
Dr. Jake Evans, affectionately known as Doc, had been Grant's friend since they were both youngsters. Grant's grandfather had taken Jake in and had practically raised the two boys as brothers until Grant had decided he wanted to get away from Bear Canyon Valley. That had been long ago. Then Grant had returned, done with roaming, to claim his rightful position in town, to live in his family's home.
I wondered.
Doc smiled.
I'm happy you finally found someone.
Astra strode into the room, a steaming coffee-filled mug in her hand. When are you going to tell her? You know she has a right to know. Doc shook his head.
Easy to see where Astra stands on the whole shifter thing.
Astra placed the mug on a table, put her hands on her hips. I buried my mother because of her relationship with a shifter. I think shifters should be with shifters. Mortals should be left out of their lives.
Your mother was my soulmate.
Doc's expression sobered. He shook his head. Grant rose, put his arm around Astra.
We were all sorry that your mother's life was taken prematurely, but we don't have many problems with enemy shifters, not like we did in the last century.
She shook Grant's arm off. You're still my favorite shifter, right behind him. She pointed to her stepfather, Doc. I'm sorry. I still have so much anger over losing Mom. She picked up the cup and took a sip. Do you plan to make Chelsea your mate?
If she'll have me, if she can accept the bear. It's clear she cares about you. I caught the looks.
Doc said.
Can we plan for a wedding? Don't put the cart before the horse.
Grant waggled his finger at him.
Jeff's up to no good. Her story about not knowing what happened to her, I don't know how much of that is true, or if she's trying to avoid a confrontation, but he definitely took her out of the parking lot, and he saw me carrying her. I was in bear form. He left the scene immediately.
What are you going to do? Astra's eyes were wide.
Pay him a visit.
Grant pulled into the driveway of Jeff's home, the most opulent in the county, boasting the realtor's success. Jeff's car was there, but the other vehicle he used wasn't. A midnight blue SUV. Gone. Grant wondered if that was an indicator of anything, though as long as Chelsea was safe with Mae, where Jeff was didn't matter. As Grant pulled back out of Jeff's long driveway, the snow began to fall more quickly in larger, heavier flakes. He put in a call to Mae's cell. When she answered, he dispensed with the niceties.
How's Chelsea?
She was fine when I left her. Said she wanted to take a nap.
Left her? I thought you were going to stay with her.
Deep within, his bear growled in his mind.
She didn't want me to. I didn't want to be forceful. I locked the door behind me. She promised she'd leave it locked, just said she wanted to be alone. She started to cry, Grant. She felt bad for inconveniencing me. And she wanted her car. She's a grown woman. I can't keep her car from her. I can't make her do what I want her to do.
Mae's voice sounded like she was upset that she'd disappointed Grant. He turned his truck around, heading toward Mae's home.
I'm going to your place. I'll call you when I get there.
20 agonizing moments later, he pulled into Mae's driveway and breathed a sigh of relief. Chelsea's car was parked there. No other cars were around. He jumped out of his truck, the hell with waking her up, and pounded up the steps of Mae's front porch, almost tripping on a chair that was sticking out. He raised his fist to pound on the door. Thinking better of it, not wanting to scare her, he rapped on it softly with his knuckles. The door creaked open. It wasn't locked.
No.
It wasn't even closed. He paused, listening, concentrating. He picked up no signs of life. Nothing. His bear could hear no heartbeat, no breathing. He could smell Jeff's scent. He either was or had been in the house. Grant took his phone out and punched redial. When Mae answered, he asked, trying to keep the panic he felt from invading his voice.
Which room is Chelsea's?
First one at the top of the stairs on the left.
At the other end, Mae gasped.
Why are you asking? What is it?
Her car's here. She's not.
I'm on my way over.
She hung up the phone before he could tell her that she couldn't help and that it wasn't a good idea for her to come home.
Damn it.
She couldn't help. She'd get in the way, maybe even end up hurt herself. Who knew what kind of wild card Jeff was? He stormed up the stairs and ran through the open door at the top on the left. Her door. The room was empty. A cup of tea sat on the dresser. He touched the porcelain. Still warm. It hadn't been long since she was there. The drawers on the dresser were open and empty. The closet was empty, too. No clothing hanging there. Grant raged out the front door, looking for tracks. There, barely visible in the blanket of snow that had begun its downward drift, large tires. An SUV, most likely. He was certain it had to be Jeff's. He roared, shifted, and began to follow, going in the direction of the tracks, losing them on the main road, but knew there was no other way they'd go. If Jeff had taken her hostage, he wouldn't go to a heavily populated area. More likely than not, the man had some property somewhere in the area. He'd take her there, an abandoned building. Grant didn't know where, but he knew he wouldn't give up looking. He kept up a brisk pace, staying hidden by the tree line just off the road until he saw tracks on a cutoff. He stopped, studied them, and brushed the light blanket of snow off. Same tread. Had to be it. He took off after the tracks, following them. There it was, the SUV, stopped, parked at the end of the road. Grant couldn't move for a moment. Concern for Chelsea paralyzed him. He knew where this road led, to the abandoned lookout post. That's when he'd noticed the driver's side door was open. His bear's sharp ears heard it before he saw it. The sounds of drops methodically hitting the ground. Coming around the back of the vehicle, he approached the door with caution. In the driver's seat, Jeff, dressed in an impeccable suit, was sprawled out. One hand on the wheel, the other at his side, but dangling out of the vehicle, dripping blood. The immaculate appearance of his suit was marred by a large pool of blood that wove its way down to his fingertips, then plopped on the ground. The blood was becoming solid, and the dripping was slowed by the cold temperature. Grant stepped closer, careful, not sure what he would encounter, and wondered if the man could be alive after losing all that blood. He paused in front of the door. Jeff's eyes were open, a look of surprise and horror on his face. There was a knife next to him. Grant stared at the dead man. Chelsea couldn't have done this, could she? Had Jeff attacked her and she'd killed him in self-defense? Where was she now? His bear took over, sniffed for her, and found her scent easily. Found another scent, too, a male. Had someone found her? Was that someone helping her, or was it an enemy? He didn't recognize the scent. Grant took off at a fast pace, running between trees, chasing her scent. It grew stronger and stronger, staying on a main path, heading somewhat toward the abandoned post. Was this a local? Who else would know about the post? Grant slowed to get his bearings and to scent for her location. His breath left tiny puffs in the cold air. That was when he heard them. Voices, one man's, one woman's. Chelsea. Who was that with her? The man was hidden by a large tree trunk. Chelsea was talking. No, I don't know what he was talking about. Grant grit his teeth at how disheveled she appeared, and how pale. Clearly this asshole wasn't taking care of her. There was a fresh bruise on her cheek, on the same side as the laceration from the night before. His bear roared deep within Grant's brain, causing his head to ache. He fought to regain control.
Don't lie to me.
The man's voice was a loud snarl.
He said you have a boyfriend.
A hand popped out from behind the tree, and Chelsea swerved and ducked, avoiding the swing. Grant gripped the tree trunk. He was going to kill this man, whoever he was. He held the bear in him back from charging. He didn't know what weapon the man had trained on Chelsea. He couldn't afford to have her shot or cut. Chelsea was talking again. Jeff doesn't know anything about me, nothing at all. He asked me out. That's all there is to know.
So who is this Grant that he mentioned?
Chelsea paused, was silent for a moment. He's a man I know. You don't need to worry about it. There's no reason to hurt him, too.
I told you, I won't have other men looking at you. Jeff got his just desserts. This Grant fella will, too. I'll get you situated somewhere, then I'll go take care of him.
The man moved out from behind the tree. Grant got a good look at him. Dirty jeans, a scuffed-up coat, unshaven, and with an angry scar that crossed his cheek. That was Chelsea's ex, the one she was running from, a cop, probably armed. Snow and leaves crunching nearby caught Grant's attention. He looked across the clearing they were in to see if the man or Chelsea had noticed, but they seemed too embroiled in their argument. Grant scrutinized the source of the noise. What was back there? Then it came into view. No, she came into view. What the hell was Mae doing here? What the hell did she think she could do? She'd make things worse. Now the asshole would have 2 hostages.
Damn, damn, damn.
Chelsea and the man hadn't seen Mae yet. Grant tried to wave her off, not worried that he was a bear because she'd seen his bear before, and having been married to a shifter, she was no stranger to shifter ways. She wasn't looking in his direction and didn't see him. Instead, Mae stalked closer to the couple, a shotgun in her hand. Great. That made things worse. She'd more than likely be shot. The man turned to Chelsea, grabbed her, and shoved her in front of him, then yelled,
Put the shotgun down and step away from it.
Shit! He'd seen Mae.
Mae?
Chelsea's voice shook, tears oblivious.
Oh, Mae.
Chelsea had lowered her voice, but his bear still heard it.
Why did you come out here?
I had to make sure you were okay. Mae put the shotgun down and sidestepped, locking eyes with the man.
Who are you?
This is Derek, Mae, my boss. Chelsea was introducing them as if they were at a social event, not as if he was a killer who'd stabbed and killed Jeff and was holding her hostage at gunpoint. Derek indicated the shotgun.
Go get that, Chelsea, and bring it to me. Don't try anything, or I'll have to blow a hole in your friend Mae here.
Stop. I'll get it. Don't hurt her.
Chelsea stomped to the shotgun, picked it up, and carried it to Derek. Derek checked it.
Loaded, huh?
He smiled an evil grin.
Aren't you the brave little missus?
A sneer crossed Mae's face. Grant wondered if she knew he was watching. A part of him was glad she was here. He didn't want to risk scaring Chelsea with his bear. He stepped from behind the tree and bush that had given him a hiding place. He reared up on two legs, threw his head back, and released a roar of pure anger. Chelsea screamed.
What the fuck?
Derek raised his handgun.
No!
Mae yelled. Grant closed the distance rapidly, his bear seeing red. He had every intention of not killing Derek, but he couldn't say the same for his bear, especially when Derek pulled the trigger. The round caught Grant in his upper torso, ripping into his shoulder. He didn't let it affect his momentum. He raised his claw, swiping at Derek, catching him across the throat. Blood spurted. At the same moment, Derek pulled the trigger again, delivering another round into Grant. Then the man collapsed. Grant fell on top of Derek, crushing him before he rolled over. Chapter 18. Chelsea stared at the bear that had attacked Derek. Huge and furry, it lay still. Derek was bleeding from his neck and lying very, very still. There was no way he'd live through that mauling. She couldn't say that she was upset. Did this mean the nightmare of running was over? She backed up, afraid that the bear would still be alive and attack her. Mae was crying, reaching for the bear, and kept repeating Grant's name. Chelsea grabbed for Mae's shoulder.
Let's go.
If the huge animal came too, it would kill both of them with a single swipe.
Grant's not here. Let's go. Now, before he wakes up. Hurry,
she hissed. Mae shrugged her off.
No, don't you get it? I can't leave him. I won't. Don't you know?
A part of Chelsea did. A memory was returning, being carried. But she didn't want to. No, that couldn't be. But her memory said it was true. She sat next to Mae, buried her head in her hands, and rubbed her temples. Mae was talking to the bear, beseeching it.
Please, Grant, you know you can't die. It doesn't work like that.
Woman, you're killing me. Quit the smothering. And what the hell were you doing?
Grant's voice? Chelsea's head snapped up. It was him. His shoulder was bloody, a mess of flesh torn up, but not as bad as... Was it possible it wasn't as bad as it had been a few seconds ago? How could that be? He healed fast. Was that related to the bear? She couldn't tear her eyes off his wound.
You...
Now you know my secret.
His voice was a groan. A small smile, tempered with pain, played on his lips. I was starting to wonder if I knew it. I'm remembering that night, and I don't think it was a hallucination. He shook his head.
It wasn't.
He groaned in pain. Mae put her hand on Grant's shoulder.
You had me so worried.
And what were you thinking, coming out here like some damn vigilante?
He put his hand on Mae's. Everything came crashing down on Chelsea. Grant and Mae. It was true. She stood, rubbed her hands together. What the hell was she going to say? She couldn't leave. She had no car. She had no way to get to her car. Jeff was dead in his SUV. She would have to stay while they called the police. At least she was done running from Derek, but she'd have to deal with avoiding these two while everything wrapped up. More running, it would seem.
Chelsea?
Grant rose to his feet, wincing as he rolled his shoulder.
Wait.
I'm sorry. Chelsea shook her head. I never meant to come between you two. I feel so guilty. I was confused. What happened? That shouldn't have happened.
Chelsea?
Grant started again.
Please, wait.
Chelsea turned to Mae. I'm so very sorry. I didn't mean to do anything to hurt you. I wasn't planning to.
I think there's a misunderstanding.
Mae looked from Grant to Chelsea.
Chelsea, Grant is more like my nephew.
Chelsea laughed mirthlessly. The pain of all this stung too deeply, penetrating the shock of the last few hours' events. You're too. No, he's not. You're about the same age. Was Mae trying to make her feel better?
Mae was married to my second cousin,
Grant added. And that means? Chelsea didn't want to get her hopes up.
It means you're the one I want.
Grant pulled her close to him. Chelsea shivered, but ignored the cold. She looked at the blood on his shirt. She couldn't process what he'd just said. It didn't want to sink in fully, so she did what she always did. She opted for a practical detour with a question. Don't you need to see a doctor?
No, I don't, though I'll see Doc Evans shortly, just to make sure.
He rolled his shoulder. She could see that under the shot-shredded fabric, the skin was beginning to heal, leaving behind the bloody mess of his shirt, but at least his flesh was mending. She shook her head, trying to wrap her mind around that. At the same time, she recalled the other night when she'd been hurt and drugged up, the fur, the warmth, the tenderness of being in the bear's embrace as he carried her to the cave. You became a bear. He touched her forehead with his lips, a tender kiss.
My kind does that,
he whispered in her ear. Mae watched them, not saying a word, except there was a big smile plastered on her face, as if she'd just gotten a great birthday present. Chelsea was starting to understand the nature of Mae and Grant's friendship, and at the same time she felt foolish for having thought differently. A slow warmth, unimpeded by the coldness of the day, washed over her. And your cousin who was married to Mae? The same thing? Mae cleared her throat and waved her arm around as if to indicate Derek in the situation, bringing them back to the present. Grant nodded.
We need to take care of all this.
Let me handle it, Mae said.
I can make it all go away. I need you both to go, though, quickly, and you're going to call Doc for your shoulder.
When Grant opened his mouth to protest, she held up her hand, a command in her gesture, brooking no argument.
You sure?
Grant's eyes closed slightly as if he doubted her. What do you mean? Chelsea was becoming more confused with every moment. Mae tossed Grant a set of keys.
Take her out of here while I take care of this. Send Joe to get me. I'll call a friend to help me out with some of the logistics. I'm parked near the SUV.
Grant snatched the keys out of the air, then put his uninjured arm around Chelsea.
We'll be at the house.
Chapter 19. In his front hall at home, Grant stripped off his shirt, then looked at his wound in the mirror. It was completely healed. Chelsea's eyes widened. I can't believe it. She shook her head. Just like that, you're healed. Grant nodded. It still amazed him, especially since it wasn't often that he was shot or injured to this degree. His days of conflict had ended years ago, and as of late, he'd settled nicely into being the clan's head. A quiet, drama-free leader who tolerated no trespassers on their territory and no issues that would attract the attention of humans. So does that mean you don't die?
No, I can die, but not from this sort of thing. It's more about separating me from my bear. That would cause me to become a...
He hated using the word. He hated that it sounded like he was minimizing it.
It would make me more human. Then I'd live a human life, and I'd be killed by things that kill humans." A puzzled look crossed Chelsea's face. He took her by the hand and led her out of the hallway into the library, in front of the large desk. "I'm not immortal, but our kind has longevity, long, long lives. And we don't die unless we're separated from our bare spirits." She sighed. "I don't have to understand it." Her gaze roamed over his chest, and a desire lit in the back of her eyes. He scented her arousal, and it awakened both the bear and the man in him. The adrenaline of being wounded and having to save the woman he wanted as his mate heightened his sexual drive. In his pants, he felt his cock straining, pushing, wanting her. Wanting to possess, own, take, and brand himself deep within her. "Do you want to?" He was going to ask if she wanted to understand it, if it mattered enough that she'd want to know, but how would he do that? How could he show this woman how much she'd come to mean to him when he wasn't sure if she was in as deep as he was? Chelsea cocked her head to the side, a glint in her eye. "I do." A tiny frown crossed Grant's forehead. "You do what?" "I do want to." She placed a hand on his stomach, then her fingers crept their way up over his chest, wandering through his sprinkle of hair, up over onto his uninjured shoulder, and then around his neck. She stepped closer into his hemisphere, her eyes sparkling, locked on his, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the roaring fireplace Joe had started in the library before he'd left them alone. Without taking his eyes off hers, he reached for her top, took it by the hem, and raised it over her head. Her skin took on the glow from the flames, its fairness enhanced. Her bra was low-cut, leaving the upper halves of her creamy breasts exposed for his viewing pleasure. A tiny dusting of freckles made its way across her chest, dissipating at the swell of her breasts. Her chest moved with each breath, as if she was offering her body to him. "Chelsea." His voice was a rumble from deep within, part his, part his bear's. He picked her up and set her on the desk, then reached behind her, unhooked her bra, and pulled it off, setting her breasts free, her nipples at attention, dark pink, like candy kisses, waiting for his touch. He lowered his head, blew a breath on one, watched it pucker and harden. Chelsea gasped, threw her head back, her legs spreading, probably unaware of the picture of desire she made. Certainly not aware of the depths to which his cravings ran. Grant took her nipple in his mouth, drawing it in, sucking on it, letting his teeth graze it as she moaned, and dug her fingers into his scalp. Her nails bit into his flesh. He reached out for her other breast, weighing the fullness in his hand, squeezing it with his thumb and forefinger, plucked and rolled its hardness as Chelsea squirmed on the desk. Her moans were taking him to a place he wouldn't be able to return from. He wasn't sure he could do what he'd done in the cave and not fill her. His body yearned to have her slickness wrapped around his shaft, milking his lust, pouring her desire over him. While his mouth pulled on her nipple, his hand drifted down, unbuttoned and unzipped her pants, and tugged them over her hips. She raised her ass, and he slid them off. Her aroma rose, searing his senses with the essence of her flavor, pushing all inhibitions aside. Gentleness be damned. He shoved her legs apart, lowered his head to her trimmed patch, and inhaled her, taking her scent in, filling his lungs with the everything of her. Chelsea held her breath, her fingers entwined in his hair, pushing him lower, wanting his mouth to take her in the way his heart had taken her very soul. His tongue touched the top of her slit and slid through the folds. She gasped. Then his tongue touched her clit. A cry escaped her throat, one of desperation. She had to have him and to be had by him. "Grant!" She couldn't control the acuteness of the urgency driving her forward. Where was the shy girl who never took the first step? "I need you." She spread her legs, putting her heels on the edge of the desk, opening herself to him. He spread her lips with his fingertips. "Fuck, I love your pussy. It's beautiful." He blew a gust of his breath over her. Its hotness turned cool as it passed over her lips.
He spread her even more, unhooding her tiny nub, touching his tongue to the sensitive little core. Chelsea jumped as if an electric charge had touched her clit. The sensation traveled to her nipples, and then, rather than stopping, it sent a surge straight to her head. She closed her eyes as the sensation passed through her. He slipped a finger in.
"So wet for me already."
Chelsea moaned, heard the sound of his zipper, felt something hot and full pressing against her entrance. She reached down, felt his velvety steel shaft, its mushroom head with a defined ridge throbbing against her fingertip. She wiggled, trying to get him to enter her channel. She wriggled even closer to the edge of the table. Grant reached around, took her ass in his hands. She shifted her pelvis, put her hands on his hips. With a thrust and a stretching, he was in her, filling her, pushing her to the place she'd never been before. He was huge compared to anyone else she'd been with, and it seemed he swelled even more, filling her to an almost painful level. She gasped. His desire was fueled as he pulled back, his head almost completely out, and drove back into her, a grunt on his lips. In and out, he thrust in the same way several times while a fierce feeling began to build in Chelsea. She couldn't pinpoint it, but somewhere, in her mind or in her body, or both, a wave was cresting. She pushed it back, overwhelmed and confused by the intensity of it.
"Fuck, you're so tight, baby,"
Grant groaned, pushing her thighs further apart, driving deeper. He pulled out completely, leaving her with an empty desolation and a need to be fulfilled. Grant pulled her to her feet, turned her around, and pushed her against the desk, her body flat on its surface. He spread her legs with his knees, put his palm on her lower back. She felt his cock against her lips and shimmied backward, needing its promise of pleasure. A moan slipped out. "Please." She didn't even realize she was begging at first. Grant thrust, pushing her open while encasing his shaft deep within her. She grunted as he hit the back wall of her pussy and began a rhythmic, fast pumping. Grabbing her hips, he pulled her tighter toward his body. He raised a hand, brought his palm down on her ass. She flinched, her muscles tightening around him, grabbing his pulsing cock as he pushed it in deeper. A starburst behind her eyelids was followed by a scorching sensation in her veins as she orgasmed, leaving a creaminess in her wake. Her muscles tightened even more, milking him as he roared and leaned forward.
"You're mine."
His voice was a hiss, its timbre laced with lust and need. "Yes." She felt another orgasm starting and pushed back on him.
"Forever mine,"
he grunted, pumping, holding her hips.
"There won't be another."
"Never. All yours." Her voice was a pant, the words torn from her throat, but given willingly from her soul. He pulled her up, grabbed her breasts with both hands while his cock was still firmly buried in her. At the base of his cock, surrounded by her lips and pulsing muscles, she felt his throbbing member swelling. She knew the source of his desire was traveling the length of his cock, pushing forward to join with her own juices. With another roar, he bit into her shoulder and released his essence deep within. A pulsating stream of heat hit the back of her channel, then traveled downward, coating her walls and his cock.
"I love you."
His voice was low, a whisper as his breath traveled over the back of her neck.
"My mate, I've waited so long for you."
A sigh passed over Chelsea's lips. She snuggled backward, enjoying the comfort of his love, the nearness of his touch. Epilogue. A month later. Chelsea looked up when she heard the door open, but she didn't need to look up to know who it was. The spot on her neck where Grant marked her during the couple bond tingled whenever he was around, a subtle sensation that reminded her she belonged to him and he belonged to her. Grant smiled that smile, the one he reserved for her alone, as if no one else in the world existed. Her stomach did one of those things it always did when he was around, like jumping beans were overreacting. She hoped the sensation would never go away. She'd moved out of Mae's and into Grant's place less than a week after Jeff's death. His murder had gone unsolved. There was nothing in the news about Derek. When Chelsea had brought it up to Grant once, he'd said he didn't know and didn't want to know, that Mae had taken care of it. Now Chelsea understood the nature of their friendship. They'd known each other for a long time. He was more like a nephew, as Mae had explained it. Chelsea was the last one in the shop. She'd told Mae she'd lock up when Grant came to pick her up. She'd kept her job at the salon because she couldn't imagine a life of idleness, and Mae turned out to be a wonderful friend, even more wonderful than Chelsea had ever hoped for. She was the big sister Chelsea had always wanted. Chelsea practically ran to the front door to greet her bear. She hugged Grant, leaned in for a kiss. His mouth claimed hers while the bonding mark burned with renewed fervor and heat pooled between her legs. Mae said something. I guess you could say it spawned a question. She looked up at him with a sparkle in her eye, took his hand, and led him to the door. They slipped outside, and the door locked behind them.
Do tell.
Grant ran his hands along her sides, his thumbs caressing the sides of her breasts. A shiver of pure passion ran through her. She laughed and glanced around to see if any of the local residents were out after dark, if they'd get caught making out on the sidewalk. The coast was clear.
She said you were more like a nephew to her.
Nephew?
Grant laughed.
She has lots of nephews.
The mysterious smile on his face made Chelsea curious.
What are you not telling me?
She gave him a wry look.
Secrets already?
Never.
He placed his lips on hers.
Never secrets, never again.
His tongue took control, and she surrendered to his assertiveness, relishing his maleness.
Mae's mate was the chief of our clan. She enjoys helping any of us whenever we need her.
Her mate was... If her mate was the chief, who is now?
He planted a finger in the middle of his broad chest.
I handle things now when they need to be handled.
She jumped when she heard a footstep, swinging her head to look behind them.
Mae, what's wrong?
Why was Mae back?
Nothing. Not really, I think.
The vivacious woman smiled at Chelsea, pulled her coat tighter around her body, then turned to Grant.
I have a nephew who will be stopping by.
Grant didn't say a word. He cocked an eyebrow and kept his eyes on Mae, waiting for her to finish her thought.
He will need a place to stay, some privacy if possible. He can stay in one of our cabins. There are several empty ones.
Grant looked at Chelsea as if to make sure she didn't mind. Of course she didn't. She nodded in agreement.
I was hoping you'd say that,
Mae said with a sigh. A man stepped out of the shadows, tall, muscled, handsome. Chelsea gasped as he came closer. There was dried blood on his lip and a cut on his eyebrow, a healed cut. His face looked like he'd been in a bar brawl and lost. The man smiled a sheepish grin, shrugged.
A scuffle.
His voice was a low rumble.
No biggie.
Chelsea knew immediately that this was no ordinary man. He was one of Grant's kind.
This is Kane.
Mae put her hand on the man's shoulder.
Thank you for giving me a place to stay,
Kane said. Grant nodded.
Any nephew of Mae's is welcome.
Chelsea snuggled closer to her bear. Finally, she was home. Taking Grant's hand, she wondered if Kane would stick around long enough to attend the wedding. "We'll enjoy the company," Chelsea said, and smiled at the newcomer. This has been Protection, Shifter Forever Worlds, written by Elle Thorne, narrated by Megan Kelly. Copyright 2014 by Elle Thorne. Production copyright 2017 by Elle Thorne.